Hello and welcome to Diabetes Open Hours, your live Q&A opportunity with experts in diabetes management and care. My name is Kayla Runka and I'll be your moderator for today. I would like to start by acknowledging that I'm calling in from Toronto and that I'm located on the traditional Indigenous territory of the Wendat, Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabeg, and the Mississaugas of the Credit, and that Toronto is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. As a health-focused organization, Diabetes Canada recognizes that there is systemic racism within and throughout our institutions, and that we have the responsibility and the power to create culturally safe and appropriate environments of care. Today's topic is exercise for everybody, and yes, everybody enjoys and is capable of movement in a way that feels good to you. And while we have experts on the call today, this session is in no way meant to replace a regular visit with or the information you obtain from your own medical health professional. Today, we are very lucky to have Dr. Jane Yardley and PhD candidate Jordan Rees with us to answer your questions on diabetes and moving your body, including how often, what types, and unique considerations for people living with diabetes. Dr. Yardley is an associate professor of physical education at the University of Alberta's Augustana faculty in Camrose, Alberta, and a member of the Alberta Diabetes Institute. She is co-author of the 2016 American Diabetes Association Consensus Statement on Exercise and Physical Activity in Diabetes, and a recipient of the Heart and Stroke Foundation of Canada's Alberta New Investigator Award. Jane's earlier work focused on blood glucose responses to resistance exercise and the impact of exercise in the fasted state, and her more recent work focuses on gender-related differences in exercise behaviors and blood glucose responses in people with type 1 diabetes. Ms. Rees is a PhD candidate in the Faculty of Kinesiology, Sport and Recreation at the University of Alberta. Her research focuses on physical activity and nutritional interventions for adults living with type 2 diabetes. Jordan is also a certified exercise physiologist through the Canadian Society for Exercise Physiology and has 3 years of experience working as an exercise specialist in primary care. Before we get started, a few housekeeping things. Please note this session will be recorded and may be included as part of our public-facing channels, including our website and YouTube channel. Please know that we will take all measures to protect your privacy and will not be sharing any names or record of the chat. We ask that any comments or reactions you share be affirming and positive, and that you use this time and this feature as an opportunity to further your learning, engagement, and curiosity, and support the same in a respectful way for others. We also encourage you to discuss your learnings with your regular healthcare provider prior to making any changes to your current routine. And with that, are you ready to get started, Jane and Jordan?
Yes.
Great. So perhaps while we wait for the first questions to come in, maybe we can chat about some of the basics. So can we start by just briefly discussing the benefits of moving your body regularly for everyone, really, not just for people living with diabetes?
Jordan, did you want to take this one or do you want me to get things started?
You can get things started. Go for it.
Well, the way I would describe this to students in my undergraduate classes is that basically moving the body benefits every single organ system and part of the body. It's good for your muscles, it's good for your heart, it's even good for your digestion, your nervous system, your immune system. Pretty much every part of your body is going to benefit from moving more, simply because that's what we're designed to do. We're not actually designed to sit for long periods of time. And so the more often we move the body, and often the more vigorously we move it, the bigger the benefits to almost every system in the body. And that includes things like metabolism as well, which is why it's very important in the context of diabetes for blood glucose management. Jordan, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'll just highlight maybe if we go from like a sedentary behavior to even just small increases in physical activity, we can get many of those benefits from like 10 minutes at a time of moving our body. It doesn't always have to be a significant amount of activity. We can start small and still see many of those benefits.
That's great. Actually, that leads perfectly into the next question. And, you know, the concept of exercise or working out really brings a lot of moans and groans from people. We all have busy lives. We have multiple priorities that we're pulled into on a regular basis. So it sometimes feels like fitting in exercise is a chore. So when we talk about regular physical activity, what exactly does that mean? And is there variance, like you just mentioned, Jordan, for smaller frequent movements versus just the standard recommendations that come out of, Health Canada?
That's a great question. I think maybe just to start, we can differentiate between what physical activity is versus what exercise is, because we often use those terms kind of interchangeably. So when we're thinking about physical activity, it's any movement that we're kind of doing throughout our day that increases our energy expenditure. So we're contracting our skeletal muscle, we're moving our body, we're increasing our energy expenditure above being sedentary, versus exercise, where that's more of a planned activity. There's a little bit more structure to it. Perhaps we're engaging in it with kind of a goal in mind. We want to improve our health, our fitness. So those are kind of the two different areas that we think of, although there is some overlap between those. But in terms of increasing our overall physical activity throughout the day, I know time is a huge barrier for many people. And when we think about like our 24-hour clock, 8 hours is kind of sleep. Maybe we're working for 8 hours, and then we have family care, chores. That 24 hours gets eaten up quite quickly. So if we can think about ways to fit activity into those things that we're already doing throughout the day, like transportation is one way we can kind of increase our activity. Thinking about small mini movement breaks during our workday can be really small things, strategies that you kind of incorporate into the things that you're already doing. Jane, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, there were a few questions about this during the pandemic, of course, because a lot of us were working from home, which decreased naturally physical activity levels because we weren't even walking to our car or from our car to our office. And so there were a lot of little things that could be done throughout the day just to make sure that you are standing up and moving, which can now be incorporated into an office space as well. Keeping water on your desk is a good idea, but if you want to be sure that you're going to get up more often, keeping it in a smaller glass ensures that you have to get up and fill it more often. And of course, the more of those you drink, the more often you have to get up and use the washroom. In that regard, if you're in a building with more than one washroom, you can walk to the farthest one just to get in a few extra steps, a bit more movement while you're up and out of your desk already. Same thing with foods. Make sure you're not leaving those at your desk, because then there's absolutely no reason for you to move when you're hungry. So if you are at home, make sure those foods stay in the kitchen, which forces you to get up and move when you actually want to eat. Or again, in an office environment, if there is a kitchenette or a fridge or anything like that, leave your food away from your desk so it forces you to get up and move. And then, a lot of people drop their kids off at school when it's only a few blocks away. It's definitely a good idea for everyone to walk those couple of blocks if it's possible. I know schedules are sometimes tight and weather is sometimes not very friendly. But that is another idea that can automatically get a little bit of physical activity into the day.
Oh my gosh, I just want to ask you for more tips now. I think all of those are very applicable for me. I have a massive jug of water sitting on my desk, and if I had a smaller cup, I would be up a lot more often than I am right now. That's great. Thank you for that. When we think about the recommendations for physical activity, again, we'll get into diabetes specific, but for the general population, it is still 5 times a week, 30 minutes a day for the, cardiovascular workout. Can you talk a bit about that, as well as the different types of exercise we're to be getting on a regular basis?
Sure, I can go first, and then Jane can maybe add if that works. So we can break exercise down into those different types. Maybe the most common one that we'll think of, or first thing that comes to mind, is aerobic exercise. So that would be things like going for a brisk walk, maybe cycling, swimming, where we're doing kind of a repetitive movement for a period of time of about 10 minutes or more. So we're moving our body continuously, we're working our cardiovascular system. That would be what we call aerobic exercise. There's also something called resistance exercise or strength training, where we're looking at kind of lifting weights or moving our body against a resistance, helping to increase our muscle strength and endurance. And these are both very important types of exercise, and it's recommended that we do both if possible. And then there's also anaerobic or interval exercise. So it's similar to aerobic exercise, but at a higher intensity. So we're working harder for a shorter period of time. So those are kind of the three different types. Jane, perhaps add on to that if she has something to add.
I'm just going to expand a little on some things. The higher intensities, we've actually got a lot of data showing right now that there are huge benefits. You get a much bigger bang for your buck doing a shorter, more intense or interval type workout where you go intense for a short period of time and then recover for another couple of minutes and then go back and do that again. So it's a very effective way to improve fitness and metabolism. And that goes for, people without diabetes and people with diabetes. Personally, I'm a big fan of what we call resistance exercise, which can come in the form of weightlifting, resistance bands, body weight exercises, anything where the muscles are working against some form of resistance. And I'm honestly a true believer that everyone, male, female, all ages, diabetes, no diabetes, should be doing some resistance exercise throughout life because it is the best way to keep your joints strong, to keep a good range of motion, which usually translates into better functional mobility as we get older. And what that means is when you're getting into that, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th decade of life, you're able to get out of a chair. You're able to put things on a high shelf. You're able to get up and down stairs, get out of bed, use the bath without assistance. And those are all really important things to be able to do. And we know that they're all much easier throughout life if we take the time to do strength exercises on a regular basis from an early age.
All right, thank you. So, Dr. Yardley, you mentioned people with diabetes. And so is one of these types of activities more beneficial for people with diabetes than the others? And if so, does it vary based on whether you have type 1 or type 2 diabetes?
Any type of movement is beneficial. I think that's one thing we have to say right off the bat. You're better to move than to not move. And each type of activity that we've mentioned, aerobic, resistance, high intensity interval, each of them has their own set of benefits. And the one thing that I always bring up is that enjoyment is key. Because if you hate that type of activity, you are never going to do it. Or if you do it, you will do it rarely and begrudgingly, and it's just not going to help quite as much. There won't be the level of enthusiasm that you need. And so what I tend to say is that any exercise is good exercise, and good exercise is the exercise that you enjoy and you are more likely to do. In terms of benefits, it really just depends what type of benefit you're looking for. If you're trying to prevent cardiovascular disease, then it's very important to do exercises that will improve your cardiovascular fitness. So your heart and your blood vessels respond really well to aerobic exercise, high intensity interval exercise, but also resistance exercise. And in terms of functional mobility, as I just said, that high intensity and resistance exercise is a really good idea. In terms of blood glucose management, I'll let Jordan talk about type 2 diabetes. In type 1 diabetes, we don't really have a lot of evidence that any type of activity is going to be better for lowering hemoglobin A1C. We know there's a high risk of hypoglycemia with type 1 diabetes, which is a major barrier to activity, and that aerobic exercise is actually what confers the highest risk of hypoglycemia. So we see less of a risk of that big drop in blood glucose with the high intensity interval exercise and the resistance exercise. So if it's blood glucose and avoiding hypoglycemia that you're most concerned about, the more intense those exercises are, usually the less likely you are to have those lows during an activity. Jordan?
Yeah, I'll just add on to that in terms of type 2 diabetes. So there's quite a bit of evidence to support both aerobic and resistance exercise for improving blood sugars in adults with type 2 diabetes. Perhaps there's more research looking at aerobic exercise in lowering our A1C or blood sugar. And they recommend accumulating about 150 minutes per week to see meaningful reductions in our A1C or blood sugar. And we can see those reductions even similar to some types of diabetes medication. So it can be quite significant if we're engaging in that regular aerobic exercise and we're consistent with that. And then we know that if we add on resistance exercise to that, there's additive effects to that. So we'll see greater reductions in our A1C, and then along with all the other benefits that we can get with that resistance in terms of building more muscle, improving our strength and endurance as well. So there's quite strong evidence for blood sugar management with aerobic and resistance exercise.
We will definitely talk more about blood sugar management and exercise. We do have a couple questions in the chat that I do want to get to. So the first one is, what are the risks of inactivity specifically for people living with diabetes? And perhaps you've kind of touched on it, but maybe you could add a little bit more to that question.
Certainly, I can start off. So yeah, there's more and more research looking at sedentary behaviors, and we now actually have for our Canadian population 24-hour movement guidelines. So previously we're more focused on kind of exercise alone. Now we're thinking about our movement kind of throughout the day. How much time are we spending in sedentary behavior, and what are the risks of that? So there's evidence to show that more time in that sedentary behavior where we're maybe sitting watching TV, or sitting in our car, or sitting scrolling on our phone, those types of activities increases the risk of things like high blood pressure, obesity, or insulin resistance. It has an impact on our mood as well. So it can impact many different aspects of our health. And there's more of an emphasis on breaking up that sedentary time. Every 20 to 30 minutes, just a small get up, go to the washroom, come back to your desk, just to kind of get our body moving and break it out of that sedentary behavior. I think kind of the average adult in Canada spends at least 10 hours in that sedentary behavior, and the recommendations are to try and keep it below 8. So thinking about how can we create more movement within our day.
And I guess the one thing I can add to that, specifically in the context of type 1 diabetes, is that we have population level studies that show that those who are more active actually live quite a bit longer and have fewer complications, or if they develop complications, that they progress more slowly. So people who are inactive are more likely to die prematurely, to have problems with cardiovascular disease, and also to experience more diabetes-related complications and to have those complications develop more quickly.
Okay, maybe I'll start with you, Dr. Yardley, then, because the next question is for those people that are currently physically inactive and living with diabetes. Are there recommendations on where to begin and how to kind of get started and then stay motivated? And again, I would just like to add that this session is in no way meant to replace the conversation you need to have with your regular medical providers. So we will definitely answer that question, but definitely have a touch point with your care provider on that as well.
Well, this comes into the realm of exercise psychology and physical activity psychology. So I'm not going to pretend to be an expert in this, but what we always say is, think about what you enjoyed as a kid. Kids are naturally fairly active. And if you think back to what you did as a kid, whether it was, riding a bike or swimming or playing soccer with your friends out on the street, if there were activities that you once enjoyed, there's a good chance that you're going to enjoy those again. Remember that you're not going to be able to jump into them quite the way that kids can, because they're also just more able to adapt and usually a little bit fitter because of their higher activity levels. So, number one, start slowly, be forgiving to yourself. If you can afford it, I sincerely recommend employing a personal trainer. We will hire experts for almost every aspect of our life and our health. We'll go to dietitians, we'll go to ophthalmologists, podiatrists. Think of a personal trainer as being a health expert along the same lines. Somebody who can give you some tips, some tricks, some programs, some help to get started, some guidance to do so in a slowly and progressive way where you won't get injured and you'll be able to keep enjoying those activities for the rest of your life. Jordan, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think we all know that physical activity has benefits, and I'm sure a lot of us have tried to engage in activity in the past and maybe we did it for a week or so and then we fell off the wagon there. So thinking about perhaps what has stopped you in the past, what were some of the barriers that you came across? Was it time? Was it too expensive? There's lots of reasons why we won't engage in physical activity. So thinking about some of your personal barriers and how you're going to kind of problem solve around those ahead of time. It could be perhaps setting up your runners and your clothing the night before, have them ready to go by your bag to take to work, and then you're going to go for a lunchtime walk, for example. So you're setting yourself up for success in little ways. I think that can be really helpful in getting started and starting to build that confidence as you're newly engaging in an activity.
I love that. I think confidence is a big thing too, especially if you're just starting out on a physical activity program. And I also would love to say that my massage therapist, who's obviously on her feet all day long, so she doesn't want to go for a walk or a run or a bike when she's standing, but she starts her day by dancing to one or two of her favorite songs, and she ends her day that way as well. And I love that idea. So happy to pass that on for anyone listening right now. Excuse me. So specifically, let's talk about people living with diabetes, and let's start with those. I use the phrase type 1, but let's just talk about people who are taking insulin, because there is both type 1 and type 2 that use insulin to help maintain their blood sugar. So are there special considerations for people who are taking insulin that need to be considered when they are exercising or starting a program?
Definitely. Insulin is the main reason why blood glucose levels will drop really quickly once exercise starts. And so it really helps to plan in advance when you know you're going to be doing activities. And that can even include things like gardening or walking to the grocery store. You have to remember that these are still physical activity and they're still causing muscle contraction. So for anyone who's using insulin injections, it's recommended that the dose be decreased prior to exercise. If it's a long-acting insulin that you're using, only long-acting insulin, there are recommendations of about a 10% decrease either the night before or the morning of the day that you're planning on being active. If you're using fast-acting insulin at meals, you can decrease that fast-acting insulin, they say up to 50 or 80%, depending on how close your meal is to the activity that you're going to be doing. Really try to avoid doing activities when your insulin is going to be peaking. And we know that for most of the faster acting formulations now, that's somewhere around 30 to 50 minutes, 30 to 60 minutes after injection. For insulin pumps, the recommendation is usually to decrease the infusion rate, and that can be 50 to 80%. I've even seen some recommendations as high as 100%, depending on the activity and the timing of that activity. And we want to be doing that about 90 minutes to 2 hours ahead of exercise. If it's impossible to decrease insulin in advance, and that happens for some people because you just, all of a sudden it's like, oh, hey, I've got time. I'm going to go do something active now. And if that's the case, making sure to have some fast carbohydrates around and accessible in case those blood glucose levels drop pretty low. Using continuous glucose monitors, we know, is a very successful tool to help at least know where blood glucose levels are and be vigilant of them dropping so that we can preempt the low glucose. And my personal favorite, one that's been coming out a bit more in the research lately, is actually fasted exercise. For people who are using insulin injections or insulin infusions, there tends to be a lot less insulin in circulation if exercise is performed first thing in the morning before breakfast. So no snacks, no boluses, get out of bed and get going. And in addition to the lower insulin, there are other hormones, things like growth hormone and cortisol, that are a little higher in the morning, which will tend to promote fat as a fuel source rather than glucose. And that means that glucose levels will actually tend to stay pretty stable or even increase a little bit for most people if they're doing that exercise before their breakfast. But again, always be vigilant, keep an eye on what's going on. And if you have that continuous glucose monitor, keep it nearby.
Okay, great. So assuming that, people that are taking insulin, keep something close by, have something available, because lows tend to be the biggest risk, I'm assuming, for people on insulin.
Biggest risk and also biggest barrier to being physically active. The fear of hypoglycemia is consistently listed as the #1 reason why people with, well, type 1 diabetes for sure, but I would think that that also extends to individuals with type 2 diabetes who are using insulin.
And then Jordan, let's talk about people who are not on insulin anymore and maybe some oral medications or just managing with diet and lifestyle. Can you speak about, the same thing, some of the risks, if there are any, and maybe even some of the barriers, because I'm assuming, moving when you live in a larger body can also be a bit of a complication for some people in terms of their motivation to get out and be active as well.
Yeah, certainly. So with type 2 diabetes or people who are just taking oral medication or managing with just diet and exercise alone, the risk of hypoglycemia is quite low. But there still is that fear. Some people hear the risk of hypoglycemia and diabetes more coming from that type 1 diabetes community. I think a lot of people with type 2 have that fear of becoming hypoglycemic. So maybe clarifying that the risk is quite low in individuals taking oral glucose medication. And also, like it's a disease of hyperglycemia or high blood glucose. And when we're engaging in regular activity, it helps to lower that, but the risk for hypoglycemia is low. So that's kind of just some education around that, I think is helpful for people with diabetes. In terms of the timing of exercise, depends what your, I guess, goals are. So typically with type 2 diabetes, after someone has a meal, we'll see a postprandial increase or a spike in blood glucose after they have a meal. And that could be a very effective time to exercise for this population to help kind of balance out that spike to reduce those hyperglycemic peaks throughout the day. So there's this idea of exercise snacking in type 2 diabetes, where maybe we can't fit in like a 60-minute walk. But if you could fit in 10 to 20 minutes after each meal, that could help to kind of reduce those spikes in glucose that we see throughout the day. That could be one kind of strategy to break it up into smaller chunks. The idea of fasted exercise in type 2 diabetes is maybe less studied, but perhaps there could be some benefits over the long term if we're regularly engaging in fasted exercise. When we think about diabetes, like how it develops, typically we have excess storage of fats in our organs and our muscle. And when we engage in regular fasted exercise, perhaps we might see the fuel source coming from those stores in our organs. So that could be one method as well, but less research in that area. In terms of exercising in a larger body, it's finding movement that feels good for your body. So there's research on aquatic exercise in terms of reducing joint pain and feeling like it's easier to move in the water. There's less risk of kind of rubbing of the skin, which can be quite painful as well. So finding activities that feel good for you, and water could be one kind of option for sure.
Great. I'm assuming that would apply to as we age as well, when our joints and body parts are starting to get a little bit more less fluid and more painful.
Certainly, yeah. With osteoarthritis, especially in the lower limbs, aquatic exercise can be very beneficial.
Okay. And things like riding a bike, I'm assuming, would also fall into that category where it's not 100% weight bearing.
Yeah, less of an impact for sure with cycling.
Okay, great. We have another question in the chat about specifically longer periods of exercise. So if you're doing multi-hour exercise or training for an event, any suggestions for drinks or products that would contain electrolytes and glucose for people living with diabetes? I know it's not probably a topic area that you tend to cover, but I thought I'd ask because it's there.
So what I'm speaking from now is mostly personal experience and not actually from the research perspective. I mean, what we do know from the research perspective is that if you want something that's going to be absorbed quickly and appear in the bloodstream fairly quickly, that a lot of these commercial products are designed to be used by different transporters in the gut, more than one type of transporter in the gut. And so some of these commercial products are extremely effective for maintaining energy throughout longer amounts of exercise. When we say longer amounts of exercise, normally for anything up to 90 minutes, you don't really need a lot in terms of supplementation. 90 minutes, whether you have diabetes or not, is usually the point at which you start needing to take in a little bit of carbohydrate and potentially electrolytes, depending on the temperature. Electrolytes aren't always necessary unless, again, you're talking about really long amounts of time at relatively warm temperatures. And, you know, in terms of the amount of carbohydrate intake, there's a guideline of 1 gram per kilogram of body mass per hour. But at the same time, there are studies showing that once you get sort of beyond 60 grams per hour, that you start to see a lot of upset stomach and problems digesting. And especially that gets worse as the intensity of the exercise gets worse. So a lot of this is going to depend on how long, what type of activity. It's easier to eat while on a bike than while running, for example, just because of the bouncing that happens in the gut, and how much performance, you know, you're expecting to get out of your body. But in terms of commercial products, there are so many out there, and the tip is usually try lots of different things in training and don't do anything new on race day. So if you know which event you're going to participate in, check to see what's going to be available at the aid stations on the course and see if that's something that your body agrees with. If your body agrees with it, then continue to train with it. If it doesn't, find something else, but make sure that you are carrying your own supplies on race day. So I can't really give specific product information because that's really not my area, but those are sort of some general guidelines for distance training.
Understood. Yeah, and great advice. On that note, though, how big of a role does hydration play in exercise and people living with diabetes?
I'm going to just hazard a guess here that it's probably more important for people with type 1 diabetes than type 2, simply because there's a higher risk of hyperglycemia, so high glucose during competition, just because of adrenaline. So if you're still talking sort of racing and training at higher intensities, there's a tendency for sugars to kind of creep up over the course of events. And the longer that sugars stay high, the more likely that you will be dehydrated because your body tries to flush it out in your urine. And so especially on warm days, because we also know, and I'm again mostly speaking from the perspective of type 1 diabetes here, we know that there are some minor impairments in being able to cool the body for people with type 1 diabetes. And so it's really important to maintain hydration during those events. Little trick from somebody who's done a lot of distance stuff. When you go through those aid stations, grab 2 cups of water, one for you, one over your head. That helps you cool things down a little bit as you keep on going. I'm sure Jordan has some stuff to add to that.
Yeah, I'll just add, similar for type 2 diabetes, there's a reduced capacity to dissipate heat. So it is really important if you're going out for a walk and it's 30 degrees to ensure you're well hydrated for that. And as well, if you're engaging in activity and you're starting that activity with high blood sugars, so say you test your blood sugars and they're around 16, recommended to stay very well hydrated during your exercise session. So it does apply to both type 1 and type 2.
Okay, great. We have one more question. So if anyone else listening has further questions, please feel free to put them in the chat so we can answer a few more of those. But I will ask this sort of one last one. And that is for people that have been regularly exercising, is it worthwhile to change up your activities with respect to whether it's, you know, diabetes management or otherwise? Doing the same things over and over again, does it kind of reduce the benefits that you see from the activity that you're doing?
I can start. So I think we can look at this question in a few different ways. One of them is, are you bored with your activity? If you're bored with your activity, you're not enjoying it anymore, you're less likely to do that activity. So keeping things kind of fresh and trying new things can be a helpful way to stay active over the long term. In terms of health benefits, if we're regularly engaging in an activity, we'll get those health benefits. Our body will adapt and that activity will become easier over time. So for example, if we're lifting weights, we start to get stronger, that weight becomes easier. We do need to think about increasing the intensity of that. But if we're thinking about health benefits, you can kind of engage, I think, in the same activity and get those health benefits. Perhaps we're not going to see an increase in performance over time if we're not kind of challenging our body and progressively overloading it and increasing kind of the intensity or volume of the activity. But overall, for health benefits, if we're just regularly engaging in activity, we'll get those. But maybe Jane wants to add something to that as well.
I think I would echo a lot of the same thing that, you know, if you're loving it and you want to keep doing it, keep doing it. In terms of improving fitness, we normally need to see some changes in the program from time to time to stimulate new adaptations. But at the same time, if you're looking at this in the context of managing, say, insulin, different activities are going to need different insulin adjustments. And so changing that routine can sometimes lead to frustration because it will also change the way that blood glucose responds both during and after the activity. So you kind of have to weigh up, you know, as Jordan said, if you're getting bored with your activities, then yes, a change is a great idea. And if you want to stretch yourself, to push yourself, you know, maybe you want to do a 5K race that you've never done before. For that, you will have to have some progression and even some periodization. Those are two words that a trainer would introduce, which essentially means building on cycles of training so that you get the right amount of recovery and the right amount of stress on the body to get better. But, you know, if you do a half-hour walk every day and you want to keep doing that half-hour walk every day, that half-hour walk every day is going to help you stay healthy and mobile for sure.
Great. And I know, Jane, you mentioned this earlier about checking your blood sugars before you exercise. For people that maybe are not your, you know, going to the gym or exercise class kind of people, but more having a walk or a bike or something through their neighborhood, is it recommended to test your blood sugar beforehand, or does it depend on your blood sugar and sort of what your normal pattern is?
It's always a good idea to know where you are at in terms of blood sugar levels if you're about to go out and be active. You know, if you know when you're going to be active, you want to aim to be somewhere in the 8 to 10 millimole per liter range for any type of aerobic activity, whether that's a walk or a jog. We have a lot of studies showing that if you start a lot higher, it just means you're going to drop faster. But it's always recommended to know where you're at before you go out. And it's even a really good idea to know what direction your blood glucose levels are moving in. So if you're not wearing a continuous glucose monitor and you're using synthetic insulin, for example, because those are the things that are going to be the biggest risks, it's a good idea to check, you know, maybe 2 or 3 times over the hour before going out to do your activity, because then you'll know whether or not your glucose is generally going up or generally going down, because there's a difference between being at, say, 7.5 and generally going up when you're about to go for a half-hour, 40-minute walk, than being at 7.5 and generally going down. The latter one might mean that you end up finishing that walk early if you didn't bring any snacks with you. So yeah, generally a good idea to be vigilant.
Anything to add there, Jordan? Or?
I don't have too much to add there. I would say with type 2 diabetes, we're not thinking about checking our blood sugars as regularly. It's obviously dependent on the individual and what their doctor recommends. Perhaps they're newly diagnosed. That might be a time where you're checking blood sugars more regularly around exercise, but typically we're not as concerned about those lows.
Okay, great. So just before I ask one last question to our experts, we've popped a brief evaluation into the chat. If you would kindly take a minute to provide us some feedback so we can continue to learn and grow and better meet your needs. Also, if you have ideas on other topics you'd like to hear more on, feel free to pop that in the chat as well. So my last question is really generic, and I'll start with you, Jordan. Anything we haven't covered, or any parting words of wisdoms, or maybe even further tips on getting started on increased movement of our bodies for those living with type 2?
I'd say my biggest message is to find activities that you like doing, because exercise and physical activity can be such an additive part to your life, and it can bring you a lot of benefits in terms of mental health, can make you feel happier, give you more confidence, more self-esteem. So really seeking out those activities that you enjoy doing, and perhaps making it a social thing. If you're struggling doing it on your own, it could be something that you could, rather than going to a movie with a friend, you could go and do something active with a friend. So finding those things that you'd like to do.
That's great. Thank you. And Dr. Yardley?
As soon as you asked that question, I was going to say that the last half of what Jordan said there, find what you enjoy doing, which was what she said first, but find people you enjoy doing them with. I used to be very good at going out and doing stuff by myself when I was in my 20s. The older I get, the less motivated I am. And the more I feel, okay, I need to meet somebody to do this activity. So I have my regular running buddy and my regular cycling buddies. And especially if you're not 100% confident in what you're doing, having a group to do it with means you can learn from the rest of the group. And for people with type 1 diabetes, again, because this is the area that I work with the most, there are actually groups of very active people with type 1 diabetes who love to share. They love to, help people grow and learn how to be more active, how to manage insulin, what to expect with different types of activities. So finding groups like that can help support you both in terms of your movement and in terms of your diabetes management, I think can be very important for keeping lifelong activity.
That's great. Thank you both so much. So we've come to the end of our time. Thank you, everyone, for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us today. Sometimes it's hard to take time for ourselves and our personal care, but it's so important. And honestly, I think the benefits are always worth the time put in. If you haven't filled in the evaluation, please consider doing so now. The link can be found in the chat. And a very big thank you to our guest experts today. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure all of you did as well. Without the generosity of your time, our open hours would not be possible. So thank you both. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Open Hours runs the last week of every other month with a different topic and guest experts. So be sure to follow us on social or visit the website regularly for updates. To learn more and stay up to date on Diabetes Canada's work and resources, you can visit our website at diabetes.ca or check out our social media channels. We are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. You can also call our info team at 1-800-BANTING, that's BANTING, or email at info@diabetes.ca with questions. So join us again in August for our next Diabetes Open Hours. The theme will be making technology work for you. Please stay tuned to our social channels and our website for news about the date, time, and guest expert for our next conversation. And for those of you who are looking for a more concrete goal to get moving, consider joining Diabetes Canada's Lace Up to End Diabetes Challenge. You can find the website through diabetes.ca and join the movement to end diabetes and spend your September with people across Canada who are challenging themselves and their teams to lace up to end diabetes. And with that, I thank you again, and we'll see you next time.